Welcome to the Den of Dissent. This is a show where we challenge the current culture and mainstream talking points of the day. What is the news telling us? What is the culture telling us? Where is our civilization headed? And by what standard do we judge these issues? Do you agree or do you dissent? Let's find out. Welcome back to the Den of Dissent. Today I have Nick Bryant. Nick Bryant is the author of The Franklin Scandal, a story of power brokers, child abuse, and betrayal. I just got a copy of it not too long ago. He has been writing about disadvantaged children in the United States. He's been published in numerous national journals, including the Journal of Professional Ethics, the Journal of Applied Developmental Psychology, the Journal of Social Distress and Homelessness, the Journal of Healthcare for the Poor and Undeserved, and he published the Jeffrey Epstein Black Book, which you can find on the internet, and also he is a member of the organization Epstein Justice. Welcome to the show, Nick.
Glad to be with you.
Absolutely. Thank you for coming on. So just want to jump into it. I want to talk to you about your journey as well as your article on Epstein and your organization, Epstein Justice. But I've been listening to some of your interviews, and you said that you started writing. You started getting into the whole topic of child trafficking, which led you down this dark hole of information. And you talked to your publisher one day, and he said that he wanted you to write a spicy story, and you came up with, I think, Satanism or something to see
Well,
how.
actually, what happened, I was pitching an editor at a magazine in New York City. I live in New York City. And he said, pitch me dark stories. And I just kind of threw my hands up in the air and I said, Satanism, Nazis. I mean, that's the darkest I could come up with. And there was a little glint in his eye and he goes, Satanism. And that's what started my odyssey with all this.
Okay. And so when you started writing about Satanists, or you started interviewing Satanists, how did that lead you into finding out about child trafficking?
When someone is writing on a topic, and I know other writers do this too, we tend to surf the net looking for stories that might be tangential or tertiary. And I found a US Customs report about a cult called the Finders. And 2 finders were busted in Tallahassee, Florida with 6 children. And concerned citizens called the police. The Tallahassee police took one look at the finders and the 6 children. The 6 children were ragamuffins. And they put the 6 children in protective custody and they arraigned the finders on multiple counts of child abuse. And they eventually, and when I say they, I'm talking about the Tallahassee police, got a phone call from the DC police and they said that they'd been looking into the finders for quote unquote blood rituals with children and an unsolved homicide. And the next day, the Washington DC police and the US Customs executed a search warrant on the finders, and they found all kinds of sordid stuff. Actually, there was a telex from Hong Kong talking about the finders buying a couple of children. And the person that wrote the report was US Customs Officer Ramon Martinez. And after he wrote the report, he was expecting something to happen and nothing happened. And then he went to the Washington DC police and he said, what's going on with that search warrant that we executed? And the DC police said, it's becoming a CIA internal matter and there'll be no more investigation on it. And that kind of short-circuited me because I thought I knew how the world worked at that point. And what is the CIA doing covering up for some very strange people possibly doing extremely nefarious things to children. What what paradigm is that? I didn't have a paradigm for it, and that's what started my odyssey into this world, or very dark universe, you could say.
Okay. And eventually, from what I read from your book, the once the CIA got involved, or the FBI, the investigation got squashed. Um,
Yes,
did anybody end up getting prosecuted from that?
nobody.
Hmm.
Nobody got prosecuted. Everybody was. I mean, once the CIA quashed the investigation, that was it. There was no investigation whatsoever.
Okay. And I read that the police chief, he changed his whole tune. I think at a press conference, he did a press conference, and before I think he was making claims that there was something crazy going on, but then when he did a press conference, he changed his whole tune once I think the FBI and CIA got involved. Um,
Yes, the chief said that the finders were a benign counterculture commune, and so they were upgraded from a cult to a commune, and that was it. Is with the finders as far as child trafficking, everything was just quashed.
okay. Um, and was there were some rituals going on with this cult? Like
Well, that's what an informant had told the DC police, but because the DC police and US Customs have been shut down so quickly, they were really unable to investigate the allegations that had come their way.
mm, okay. Early on, when you were getting into this topic, you started to come up with a lot of evidence that was pointing in this direction of government misconduct, and the child trafficking, and you were pitching your articles to some different outlets. Um, what was your experience as far as like the rejection that you were getting? Were some of these publishers or editors giving you reasons for why they didn't want to publish the articles?
I was met with a tsunami of skepticism and incredulity. And this is when I wasn't pitching an article on the finders, but the finders opened up my mind enough to, there was the symptomology of something similar to the finders that went on in Omaha, Nebraska. And I found a documentary that had been canceled, and a state senator had written a book about this pedophile network out of Omaha. And there was very little evidence. I mean, I knew with the evidence, you could tell that something had gone down, but there was very little evidence for the kids being flown around. There was very little evidence for CIA involvement, and there was also very little evidence for blackmail, which were some of the allegations that were being made in that book and also in the documentary. I went to Omaha. I was skeptical. I knew that something had gone down, but I wasn't exactly sure of what had gone down.
Hmm.
And then what I uncovered was truly horrific. I left Omaha believing that this was a nationwide pedophile network, and it had been covered up by the FBI and Department of Justice, and that hundreds of kids probably had been trafficked. A lot of those kids were from Boys Town, the distinguished orphanage on the outskirts of Omaha. And on my last night, I had a death threat. There was all kinds of intimidation when I initially started to look into the story.
Yeah.
And when I was talking to people about it, I mean, people that were involved, it was like I was writing an expose on the KGB and Stalinist Russia. People were frightened to talk about it.
Yeah. I read a part in your book where you were traveling with a guy named Nelson. Forget his last name, but he was a photographer for one of these child predators, and he was taking very explicit pictures for one of these child predators, and he had access to some very very racy photos between, I don't know, maybe, or adults and children. Um, whatever happened with that relationship? Did he? I think you said he didn't find, he didn't give you, end up giving you any photos, blackmail
Yeah, he
photos.
said he'd deliver some photos. What I was met with so much skepticism when I got back to New York and I pitched it, and at this point I had a lot of documentation and I could prove a lot of stuff, but I kind of felt like I'm going to need blackmail pictures, and he had been a blackmail photographer,
Mm,
and he got into some legal trouble and said that he could deliver blackmail photographs if I helped him out with his legal trouble, and which in essence was helping him out with a lawyer. And I lived up to my side, but he didn't live up to his side. And but I learned a lot from him throughout the course of interviewing him a number of times.
right. Okay. Also, in your book, there was an article about the Bush Reagan administration, and there was an inquiry done which was investigating a homosexual call boy ring or male prostitute ring that led all the way up to the White House. And I was reading some of that article, and I was just completely blown away because that was back in like the 80s. And so now I'm hearing about all this Diddy, these Diddy parties, and I'm saying to myself, oh, well, they were having some Diddy parties back in the 80s. Um, what did you take away from that article?
Well, at that point, I'd interviewed a lot of people um, about that article and people that had been involved in that call boy ring, including the guy who ran it. And there were two primary people that were running that Franklin pedophile network. One was Lawrence King of Omaha, Nebraska, and one was Craig Spence of Washington, D.C. And Spence had a home that was wired for audiovisual blackmail, and he was also a CIA asset. And I believe that he was basically blackmailing people for the CIA. And we'll see it. We see it with Epstein, and I believe that we're also seeing it with Diddy.
Mm. In that article, I was reading that there was a top Pentagon official that said that there was a nest of homosexuals in the Reagan administration, and the Soviets could have been posing as male prostitutes to. Here we go with this light again. The Soviets could have been posing as male prostitutes for the purpose of trying to blackmail some of these high profile politicians. Um, and I had never heard anything about that before. Um, what do you think is what's the relationship between the child abuse and the Satanism?
I don't know. I mean, I believe that there are people that molest children that are into the occult, although a lot of quote unquote experts say there's no ritual abuse. I mean, there's people will admit that there's ritual murder, but no one will, at least on Wikipedia, will admit that there's ritual child abuse, which is kind of a little absurd.
Hmm.
But anyway, I think that the vast majority of people that use this network were just pedophiles. They were not into the occult. There
Okay,
were some kids, victims that did report ritual abuse, but the vast majority did not.
gotcha. Okay. Um, and you, when you were going down this journey too, you found out about this movie, Conspiracy of Silence, and you
Yeah,
met.
that's the documentary that was never aired,
Okay,
which perked my interest in the story.
okay, and you also met Frank DeCamp, who wrote the Franklin, not the I'm sorry, I forgot the name of his book, but it was
John DeCamp wrote the Franklin cover up.
correct, the Franklin cover up. Um, What was your experience with working with Mr. DeCamp in terms of like your research? I think
I never worked with John DeCamp. I mean, he did provide me. I mean, I was able to dig through his documentation, but I never worked with him or
okay,
worked for
gotcha.
him.
Okay. Um, moving along to Larry King, in regards to the Franklin scandal itself, Larry King, I've read he was this high roller, GOP high roller, African American, who was the fastest rising star in the Republican Party. He campaigned for George H.W. Bush, and he got indicted for 40 counts of including conspiracy, fraud, and embezzlement with the Franklin Credit Union. Um, in your research, how did this guy get involved with this child? How did he get to a point where he was able to build a whole network of pedophiles and get into child trafficking?
There were, as I said before, there were two primary pimps: Lawrence King of Omaha and Craig Spence of Washington D.C. And both of them came from humble means. And I can't really prove this, but this is what I think. They were both in Southeast Asia at the same time when the Vietnam War was raging. And King was in Thailand with a top security clearance, and Spence was an ABC reporter. And I believe they possibly got compromised at that point. They were busted molesting kids. Both those guys are big time child molesters. And there's a dark, malignant corner of our intelligence, which we saw with Jeffrey Epstein. And I think that they conscripted both King and Spence to run this network. And that's really how it got rolling. Because when both came back to the United States, their careers just went up exponentially. And my belief is that they started working for that dark, malignant corner of the CIA or intelligence that does this type of stuff.
Okay. Whatever happened to Larry King? Did he die or?
No, he wasn't. He never was charged with with one count of child abuse. Not one count, but he did rip off $40 million from the Franklin Credit Union, and he had to do time for that. And he was put in some cush prisons, Club Fed. One was in Rochester, Minnesota. And when he got out, he had essentially a no-show job waiting for him at a BMW dealership in Alexandria, Virginia. He kept his mouth shut, and he was rewarded, much like we're seeing with Maxwell right now. She's keeping her mouth shut, and she's going to do time, but then when she gets out, she'll have money. And I think the same deal was probably made with Diddy too.
Mm. With you also talk about Boys Town in the book. Boys Town is the location or the place where all of this trafficking was taking place.
Well, actually, Boys Town is an orphanage,
Okay.
and Lawrence King was plundering Boys Town for underage prostitutes. Boys Town is a famous orphanage. It might be the most famous orphanage in the world.
Okay. And because he had a close relationship with people high up in positions of government, like I was saying earlier, he was working for campaigning for George H.W. Bush. Do you think that Bush himself, George H.W., knew about what was going on, like what Larry King was involved with?
I do. I believe that George Herbert Walker Bush had been involved with a very dirty part of the CIA for quite some time.
Hmm.
And as soon as he got elected as president, even before he took the oath, Larry King was taken down by the feds. And the Franklin Credit Union hadn't been audited in 4 years. And I think that that was a fire that he needed to put out really quickly before he assumed the presidency. And Richard Thornburg and William Barr, his two attorney generals, covered up the Franklin network. There was a very corrupt grand jury. I don't know if your listeners or audience knows about grand juries, but grand juries are very easy to corrupt, a special prosecutor is chosen for a grand jury, and he's solely or she's solely responsible for what is shown, what the grand jurors are shown, and the witnesses are called. Grand jurors are just regular people that have shown up for jury duty and they've been found to a grand jury. So essentially, only what a special prosecutor wants the grand jurors to see and hear is what the grand jurors are going to see and hear. And there was a New York Supreme Court judge that said special prosecutors of grand juries have so much power over grand jurors that they could get them to indict a ham sandwich. And that's what happened with the Franklin grand juries. There were two in Nebraska, a state and a federal grand jury, that were hugely corrupt. I had the transcripts of the state grand jury, and I have a chapter dedicated to it in the Franklin scandal.
Okay.
And I show how corrupt that grand jury was. And then the federal grand jury was very corrupt too.
Yeah, I wanted to get to grand juries in regards to the whole Epstein case. Um, Now, with Bush working for Reagan as well, being in the or having a close relationship with Reagan, and this article being written in the '80s, do you think Reagan knew about what was going on with this call boy ring?
Probably not.
Okay, yeah,
I believe that he definitely knew Lawrence King, but I do not believe that he knew about the network. Most likely he did not.
okay. It just sometimes I get baffled because you have the president of the United States. I would think that he's privy to so much more information than the average citizen. And so sometimes I think, well, how could he not know if there is a prostitution ring or midnight tours with prostitutes in going into the White House when he is the man that lives in the White House? I don't know. Sometimes I
Well,
wonder.
those midnight tours were when George Herbert Walker Bush was the
Okay.
president, not when
Okay.
Reagan was.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Okay. Um, yeah, no, it's crazy. You also talked about William Barr too. What was William Barr's involvement with all of this?
Well, he helped Richard Thornburg cover up the pedophile network. There was also a very corrupt grand jury in Washington D.C. that looked into Spence's activities, the other pedophilic pimp, and didn't find anything. Didn't concluded that basically children hadn't been trafficked, even though a number of children had been trafficked. And William Barr would cover up the Epstein trafficking network. So he was Attorney General under George Herbert Walker Bush, and he was the Attorney General under Donald Trump's first term.
Okay. Do you think Trump knew that William Barr was involved in these cover-ups of these previous examples?
I
And
don't know. I don't know.
yeah. Um, Also, in your book, you talk about this guy Paul Bonacci, who gave a test. I'm sorry,
Paul Benassi.
Paul Bonacci. He gave a testimony about Larry King, and he talked about the satanic rituals. Um, what was your experience dealing with talking to Paul Bonacci and what he said about Larry King or his experience?
I found Paul to be very credible. Paul suffers from dissociative identity disorder, which was formerly called multiple personality disorder. But I found Paul told me some wild things that I was able to ultimately corroborate. There was one thing that he told me that I tried to corroborate that I couldn't. But Paul was, for the most part, very honest with me, I felt.
Yeah. And I read that he was awarded. I think he was going to be awarded $1 million because there was a suit against Larry King, but that $1 million was never collected.
Yeah, that's the case. John DeCamp was Benassi's attorney, and King was sued by Benassi for various counts of, or for various types of abuse. And King was in prison and he didn't respond to any of the lawsuit documentation. There was $1 million judgment against him for Paul Benassi, but that's never been collected.
Okay. Hmm. Um, and then I read in your book about testimony about, I think this was, I don't know if this was with the Larry King case or the Finders case, that there were rituals that involved animals, like animal sacrifice and some goats.
Well, actually, that was the Finders. There were
Okay.
pictures of kids that were cutting up a goat.
Gotcha.
But the occult aspect of this is very small. You have to keep that in mind. This
Okay.
is about a trafficking network that trafficked children from coast to coast, was in existence for about 10 to 12 years, and it produced a lot of child pornography and pandered to a lot of children. And the occult component is relatively small in this. So
Okay.
I don't
Right.
really know how much more, we need to talk about it.
Gotcha. Moving forward to the Epstein saga, you published the Black Book back in 2015. Um, how did you come across the Black Book, Jeffrey Epstein's Black Book?
In 2012, I was given the Black Book by one of the attorneys that was representing victims that were litigating against Jeffrey Epstein.
Okay. And this guy Alfredo Rodriguez, he was the guy that had access to the Black Book. He was Jeffrey Epstein's house manager, um, and he was trying to collect $50,000 to put it out.
From one of the attorneys that were representing the victims, yes.
Okay. Now
And
go
the,
ahead.
the attorney called the FBI, and the FBI did a sting on him, and he got arrested, and the FBI got the Black Book.
Gotcha. And he died in prison.
Yes, he had cancer. He was given an 18-month sentence. I don't know if he died in prison or he died outside of prison, but he had to do 18 months. And when it's federal time, you got to do 85% of your time. I think he might have died after he got out of prison, but I'm not positive about that.
Okay. Now, some of those names on the Black Book were circled. Some of those people may have been material witnesses, according to the article I read. Material witnesses to Epstein's crimes. Names such as Alan Dershowitz, Courtney Love, Donald Trump, Prime Minister Ehud Barak, um, and a few others. So there's a difference between the people that were just in the contact section of the book, and then there's people that could have been partakers of the acts. Correct?
Well, that's something we have to surmise. Why were some people circled in the Black Book by Rodriguez and other people weren't circled in the Black Book? And I think that if you're circled, that kind of implicates something possibly nefarious as far as your dealings with Jeffrey Epstein.
Okay. Because some people say, well, there's photographs of Epstein with high profile individuals, but they could have just been at a party, or they could have been in the book because maybe they did some business deals together or something like that. So sometimes we have the tendency to use a broad brush to paint everybody guilty because they're in association. Do you think that Donald Trump knew what Epstein was doing?
Well, Epstein kind of wore it on his sleeve, and Epstein actually was providing Clinton with adult women when Clinton was the president. So we have two presidents that have very suspect relationship with Craig Spence or with Jeffrey Epstein.
Okay. You said he
But
was
then we've got the Virginia Giuffre named a number of perpetrators in her lawsuit documentation. One of them was Bill Richardson, and he had been circled. Um, One of them was Glenn Dubin, a billionaire. He had been circled. One was Ehud Barak. He had been circled. One was Les Wexner. He had been circled. And she named Alan Dershowitz. I can't remember whether or not he was circled.
Okay. Regarding the Epstein, when Acosta, the former United States attorney, Jim, I'm sorry, I forgot his first name, Jim Acosta,
Alexander Ocasio.
Alexander Acosta. Um, he said that he couldn't investigate Epstein because it was above his pay grade, and he said that Epstein was intelligence. In your opinion, what kind of intelligence? What intelligence do you think Epstein belonged to?
Here's what happened there. A 14-year-old girl went to the Palm Beach Police Department with her parents, and she said that she'd been molested by Jeffrey Epstein. And the Palm Beach Police Department conducted a investigation for about a year. And they got the statements of 5 underage girls, and then they got corroborating statements. And they were ready to indict Jeffrey Epstein on 5 different counts of child abuse. And they executed a warrant on his home. And then all of a sudden, Barry Kirshner, the Florida state attorney, took that case from them and gave it to a grand jury. And that's was really, really egregious, because that grand jury had one objective, and it was to find that Jeffrey Epstein didn't molest a single underage child. Two of Epstein's victims were called, and they were crucified by the special prosecutor of that grand jury. But here's the thing with that. The Palm Beach Police Department had 5 statements, so at least 5 of those girls should have been called, and they knew of 17 more. So when that grand jury came back and said that Jeffrey Epstein hadn't molested a single child, Michael Ryder, who was the police chief of the Palm Beach Police Department, went ballistic. And he told Alexander Acosta that the feds had to activate with this, because Jeffrey Epstein it was like, Ryder called it like the worst injustice in modern times, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And so Alexander Acosta, the U.S. attorney for the Southern District of Florida, was going to convene a grand jury, but he was told that Epstein was intelligence and to stand down.
Right.
That's how that played out.
Okay. Who do you suspect was the intelligence organization that was protecting him, or that gave that order?
I think that there's a dark, malignant corner of our intelligence that does things like the Franklin scandal and also the Epstein trafficking network. And I kind of think that we might find that with Diddy if we dig deep enough.
Mm-hmm. Now, Alex Acosta, once the case was referred to him, he gave Epstein a sweetheart deal.
Yes.
And he was promoted, or he was bumped up to being the labor secretary under Trump.
When Trump came in, Alexander Acosta became the labor secretary. Yes.
Okay. Shouldn't, like, in a case like that, if a guy as powerful as Epstein, or someone involved in crimes like that, wouldn't you kind of, I don't know, scratch your head a little bit, or just look suspiciously at the U.S. state attorney for protecting somebody like that, and maybe not give him a job? I don't know. What's your take on that? What?
I kind of think that Alexander Acosta may have been awarded that job. It's hard to say. When Acosta was being interviewed for the labor secretary job, people in the Trump administration that were vetting him asked him why he gave Epstein a sweetheart deal, which entailed Epstein was sentenced to 18 months in a county jail, and he served 13 months. And that's when Alexander Acosta said that Epstein was intelligence, and I was told to back down. And very few people in the government can tell a U.S. attorney to back down. Someone that's very, very high in the Department of Justice, or someone that's very, very high in the presidential administration. Those are the only people that can tell a U.S. attorney to stand down.
Hmm. Um, now, also, when you published the original Black Book, I think that it was on Gawker, the website Gawker.
Yes.
Um, what was the reason for why that website went down?
They made an enemy of Peter Thiel, and there was a sex tape of Hulk Hogan. Peter Thiel made it be known that anybody that wanted to sue Gawker, he would back them. And Hulk Hogan, there was a sex tape of him, and he sued Gawker for invasion of privacy or something like that. And Peter Thiel backed him. And ultimately, Gawker had a multi-million-dollar judgment against it. And eventually, they just couldn't pay for it, so they had to collapse.
Hmm. Okay. Um, Going back to the Epstein case, you said there was I think you talk about corruption within the Florida legal system um, regarding Epstein's case. I think they were working out these plea deals with Epstein, or I think Epstein's lawyers and the prosecutors were colluding on his case.
Yes, the assistant U.S. attorney for uh, the Southern District of Florida, Emery Villafana, colluded with one of Jeffrey Epstein's attorneys, Jay Lefkowitz, and they worked out that sweetheart deal for Epstein that I just told you about.
Right.
And we have their emails, so that's how we know.
What would make them do that? Like if the prosecutor's job is to prosecute and to get this person in jail, why would they work with?
They were told to stand down.
Hmm,
They were told that Epstein was intelligence and they had to stand down. That's why they worked out that deal, that very corrupt deal.
that's crazy. I mean, well, that just goes against the whole justice system. I mean, if
It does indeed.
yeah, um, and if they would have acted against that command, I'm assuming they would have lost their law license or
Well, this probably would have been fired, and someone would have been brought in as a U.S. attorney that would adhere to whoever was telling the U.S. attorney to stand down. That's how it would go.
yeah. So basically, I mean, you can. Yeah, I mean, it's no secret you can be above the law if you belong to a certain network or you're involved in a certain organization. There's just, the laws of justice just don't apply to certain people in power.
That often happens, that the laws of justice don't apply. We saw it in the Franklin scandal, and we saw it with Epstein. None of Epstein's cohorts have been indicted except for Ghislaine Maxwell. And there were various pimps that we know about that were getting the girls, and there are a lot of perpetrators that we know about who are molesting the girls. So I really believe that it was it just shows how corrupt, yes, that the federal judiciary can be. And I believe that we're seeing something similar with Diddy, because Diddy, with Maxwell, after Epstein apparently killed himself, Maxwell was indicted on 2 conspiracies, but no one else was indicted. So she was a conspiracy of 1. And with Diddy, we have him indicted on a racketeering conspiracy, and no one else is being indicted. So I think that the Department of Justice is doing the same thing with Diddy that they did with Epstein
Okay.
and Maxwell.
You recently did a video about the about Pam Bondi releasing the Epstein files,
Yes,
and why it was kind of a dud. Could you go into that a little bit?
sure. I like to make one point, though. The U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York is considered to be the most powerful federal law enforcement person in New York City. And that U.S. Attorney was Damian Williams. And Damian Williams oversaw the Maxwell trial, where only 4 witnesses were called, and those 4 witnesses had had no interactions with perps other than Maxwell and Epstein. And then, so he carefully choreographed that trial was carefully choreographed, so other names wouldn't come out. And then he oversaw the Diddy investigation, in which a number of kids were trafficked. The first 8 lawsuits against Diddy, 2 of them were minors when he molested them. And then Little Rod, the hip hop producer, said that Diddy was constantly trafficking children. So that kind of connects the two as far as malfeasance by a U.S. attorney,
So,
in addition to Alexander Acosta.
okay, so you do you think that there's an intelligence connection in the Diddy case as well?
I don't. Okay, so with Diddy, you've got to go back to Clive Davis. Clive Davis is the guy that Diddy formed Bad Boy Records with.
Hmm.
And Clive Davis has skated on so much criminality, it's mind-boggling. He's been busted for defrauding the IRS 3 times, and he was busted in the biggest payola scandal of all time. And payola is when record companies give money to radio stations to play their music. And then there was a Genovese crime figure named Pascal Falcone, and he got busted smuggling heroin into the United States, a lot of heroin. And the feds drilled into him, and they came across all these shell companies that he and Clive Davis had formed. So Clive Davis could take money from ABC Records, which he was the chairman of, and funnel it into these shell companies, and him and Pascal Falcone would split the proceeds. And Davis got away with all this criminality. He didn't spend 1 day in jail. And you talk to most people that are familiar with how the justice system works, it's almost impossible for him not to be working with the government to get that type of leniency. And that's, I believe, who took Diddy by the hand, and they walked down the yellow brick road together.
Mm. So you think Diddy, in a sense, could have been groomed for this?
I believe that it probably was by Clive Davis, yes.
Okay. In that video that you did about Pam Bondi, I think you said that there are hard drives and disks with like hard information on the perpetrators involved in the Epstein case.
Yes.
If those were to be released, those would be way more damning than the Epstein list. You're saying that's what we need. This Epstein list is really nothing, and we probably won't get it. We need the hard drives.
There is. What I'm saying is that there is no Epstein list. It's not like Jeffrey Epstein was a travel agent and he had your name on a list because he ran the Jeffrey Epstein travel agency. It didn't work that way. There's no list. But we have lots of perpetrators and we have lots of pimps. And we know who a lot of the perpetrators are. We don't need a list. We don't even need files. I mean, the Department of Justice could indict a bunch of people tomorrow if they wanted to.
Mm. I mean, do you think that the Trump administration is aiding and abetting this if they don't prosecute?
Oh, absolutely. The first Trump administration aided and abetted it. This has been covered up under George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, and also Joe Biden. 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans have covered this up. The New York Times published an article on August 29th, 2019, and it named 6 of the procurers or pimps for Epstein. One of them was Ghislaine Maxwell. The other one was Sarah Kellen, Leslie Groff, Adriana Ross, Nadia Marcinkova, and Haley Robson. Robson was young and she didn't really know a lot about that network, but Kellen, Groff, Ross, and Marcinkova knew all about that network. And they were unscathed by law enforcement. If law enforcement really wanted to get people, they would just pick those women up and indict them on multiple counts of child trafficking because they're guilty of multiple counts of child trafficking. And that's a heavy sentence in the federal system. That's 15 years to life. So if they were given 5 or 6 life sentences, they would cough up the perps, most of whom we already know. So it's obvious that there just isn't a will to prosecute these people, these perpetrators. And that's up to us. We have to make sure that our government does that. I started an organization called Epstein Justice. And I would suggest that your listeners or audience go to EpsteinJustice.com and take a look at what we're trying to do. We're trying to get a congressional commission together to make sure that these laws are enforced and that child molesters get busted for molesting children. I mean, it's kind of a simple thing, really, but right. I guess it's going to be complicated.
Some people would say, well, you're trying to get the foxes to, investigate the hen house, like you're trying to get the criminals to investigate themselves. Do you know of any congressmen that would really genuinely look into this and that aren't or wouldn't protect this kind of network?
I do. I mean, Tim Burchett of Tennessee has come out and said, my colleagues are being compromised in honey traps. And there was a letter from the Oversight Committee that 5 Democrats signed that wanted evidence from the Epstein case that was in Florida. So there is a will, I believe, but we have to bring everybody together. And when Bondi served us a nothing sandwich with those documents that she released, it showed that both the left and the right were angry about that. This is a partisan issue, that children shouldn't be molested with impunity and that the government shouldn't cover up child molestation. The right and the left can agree on that.
Right. Why do you think sometimes you look at congressmen, you look at politicians that promise one thing, and then when they get into office, they do something completely contrary to what they pledged on their campaigns. Do you think that one of the reasons why some of these congressmen or congresswomen switch their tunes so radically far is because they might be blackmailed?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I can give you 2 examples of that. There was a hardcore right winger named Larry Craig. He was in Washington, D.C. for 25 years. He represented Idaho first as a representative and then as a senator. I wrote a book called Confessions of a D.C. Madam, The Politics of Sex, Lies, and Blackmail, about a gay escort service that was providing escorts that took midnight tours of the White House. And the people that ran that escort service also provided escorts to Larry Craig, this uber right-wing conservative. And he was getting escorts from other milieus too. There was a documentary called Outrage, where it showed that Craig was getting male prostitutes from other milieus. And Craig had a horrible record against voting against gay rights. And Craig tried to pick up a vice squad cop in an airport in Minneapolis. And that's done by one person, I guess, slaps their foot on, they're sitting on the commode and one person slaps their foot on the floor, and then that signals to the other one that he's out to try. And Craig got stung by that. He took the bait, and he was busted for picking up a vice squad cop in a bathroom. Now this is a U.S. senator that's picking up a vice squad cop in a bathroom. How hard would it be to compromise that guy? How hard? I mean, a kid doing an after school project with a smartphone could compromise him. Another one is Dennis Hastert, and he shows that being compromised can be very good for your political career. Hastert was Speaker of the House from 1999 to 2006, and he had molested boys going back 40 years, and that had all been kept quiet during his meteoric ascent to be the Speaker of the House.
Mm.
And there's no way that he couldn't be compromised. The FBI knew about him. There was a FBI whistleblower named Sabella Edmonds who said that she knew that the FBI knew what Hastert was up to when he was Speaker of the House. So how could he not be compromised?
Right. That's interesting. Going back to Epstein a little bit, just a few more questions before we wrap up. Regarding Epstein's death, what are your suspicions about how he died? Do you think that he really killed himself, or you think there was some fishy circumstances regarding that?
I mean, it's fishy. There were a lot of anomalies, and I try not to focus on that because I think it's important that we get justice for Epstein's victims.
Mm-hmm.
If we focus on whether or not he killed himself, we're just going to be chasing our tails around and around and around. So the big thing with Epstein is that his victims get justice.
Right. And touching on that, you have an upcoming conference online regarding your organization and what people can do. Can you talk a little bit about that?
What we're doing is we're working very hard to put together a congressional commission to look into Epstein and the perpetrators and the pimps. And we need a majority in the House, and we need a majority in the Senate to actualize this. And as Americans, we have to put pressure on our congressmen and on our senators to do the right thing. And the right thing here is this commission and making sure that child molesters are indicted, because the government covering up child trafficking is aiding and abetting child trafficking. We've got to make sure that our government doesn't aid and abet child trafficking anymore. Like there have been instances of that, the Franklin scandal being one. And we got to make sure that just doesn't happen anymore. And I think that we'll be able to save a lot of children from pretty horrific abuse. It was Epstein and Maxwell were vicious people, and that's one thing that the mainstream media doesn't talk about. Well, the mainstream media doesn't call for justice or anything. They've been all ethical eunuchs about Epstein, but the mainstream media hasn't really conveyed how vicious child traffickers are, whether they're living in mansions in Washington, D.C. or trailer parks in Florida. Anybody that's sex trafficking is a vicious person.
Right. Regarding the times and dates, when is the date for your conference?
April 22nd. It's going to be online, and you can just go to the website, EpsteinJustice.com, put your name in on the first page, and we'll send you an email.
Okay. Few quick questions. Regarding Trump and Epstein's relationship, how close would you say they were in terms of their relationship? I recently heard about this Daily Beast article that came out. There was an author, I forgot his name in the book that he wrote, but he had some recordings of Epstein talking about his relationship with Trump, and he said that he was friends with Trump. They were good friends for 10 years, and he revealed some some things that Trump did, like with his friends' wives and things like that. In your opinion, how close were they?
I think that they were friends for sure.
Mm-hmm.
The story is that Epstein tried to molest someone underage at Mar-a-Lago, and that's when Trump booted him out. And there's another story about Epstein and Trump fighting over a mansion in Palm Beach, and Epstein ultimately getting the mansion. We don't know yet.
Right.
I mean, there's what Trump says that he just completely disengaged from Epstein, I think, in 2004.
Yeah. Okay. Um, do you like in your journey with finding out about all of this information from Boys Town to Epstein, what has it done to your perception of America and the world and justice? How does it make you view? How does it change your worldview of
Well, it's
humanity?
completely changed my worldview. I mean, I'm a completely different. I've been at this for 23 years. It's kind of taken over my life, and it's completely changed my worldview. I thought I know who the good guys were, and I thought I knew who the bad guys were before I got into all this stuff. And then I realized that a lot of the good guys are bad guys, and a lot of the bad guys are bad guys too. So it's changed how I look at the world for sure. And I've had to really work hard at not getting too dark and being devoured by it.
Yeah.
Because a lot of people, when they get into this realm, it's very dark and you can be devoured by it.
Yeah. But it hasn't numbed you. You still have hope in humanity.
If I didn't have hope in humanity, I wouldn't be the director of Epstein Justice.
Yeah, exactly. Is are you do you have a particular faith?
Yeah, I'm a Christian,
Okay.
although I'm an unorthodox Christian. Let me put it that way. But I would consider myself a Christian. I don't know if a lot of Christians would consider me a Christian, but I consider myself a Christian.
Okay. Did you I'm just curious, did you find Christ along this journey, or were you a Christian before you got into this?
I would say I was a Christian before, but this journey made me really amp my spiritual game
Mhm.
because I realized that if I didn't, if I wasn't pumped up spiritually, that as I said before, this stuff was just so dark it would have crushed me.
Yeah.
It's very important for me to maintain a spiritual equilibrium.
Yeah. Well, after reading your book and reading some of your articles and going down this rabbit hole myself, I mean, this stuff is so dark that yeah, if you're not spiritually grounded, I mean, you could just if you don't have a foundation, really, you could just lose hope in all of humanity and just become completely nihilistic about the world because we're dealing with children here. So
It could happen. I mean, that happens. I've seen it happen. It hasn't happened to me, but I've certainly seen it happen.
yeah, absolutely. Well, Nick, I thank you for your time. Thank you for coming on. Is there anything else you want to plug as far as where people can find you and what if you're are you working on any new books?
Well, I just had a book come out last year about Watergate. And at the heart of Watergate is a CIA sexual blackmail operation. And it's called The Truth About Watergate, a tale of a story of extraordinary lies and liars. And that came out last year. And but if you're gonna, if someone wants to read a book of mine, I would say The Franklin Scandal is, I worked 7 years on that book. But you can go to nickbryantnyc.com and see my website. And then I also have a podcast too.
Okay, absolutely. Thanks again for coming on the show today, Nick. And I wish you the best. Keep fighting the fight, and hopefully we get the truth out.
Okay, thank you.
Absolutely. God bless.